This is video 1.2 to talk about linear functions and their graph part 2. So in this video, your goal is to be able to write the rules from limited information. And here's the number one thing you want to remember. If it's a linear equation, then the rule should look like y equals mx plus b. Okay, so don't forget, m is your slope, and b is your y-intercept. We can also think of this as the starting value on the y-axis. So our goal here is to be able to write rules given limited information. Now, a couple of things we need to review about slope. Slope is delta y over delta x. Remember that delta means how much did y change? What did it grow by? So one way we think of this is rise over run. Since y is up and down and x is left and right on the axes on the graph, y is the vertical axis and x is the horizontal. We can think of it as rise over run. Another way we think about it when we don't want a graph is that we subtract the y's because we're trying to figure out how much they changed, and we subtract the x's. And we think of this x1 and x2 and y1 and y2, those are really two different points. So this is in the case where we're given a point. One point is x1, y1, and another point is x2, y2. And we're given these 2 points and we're trying to find the slope between them without graphing. So we can do that by subtracting. So we're trying to see how much the x's grew and how much the y's grew. And we can figure that out by subtracting the two values and making them a fraction, a ratio between the rise and the run. So we're going to use that quite a bit. The y-intercept value we're going to find by using this rule and this idea of understanding what the rule looks like. So let's take a look at the first example. So the goal is to write the rule for a line that goes through 5, 14 and has a slope of 3. So right away I see one part of my rule. Because I know my rule is y equals mx plus b, and they told me the slope is 3, I know the m value because m represents the slope. So far my rule is 3x plus something. I don't know what b is yet. But what I can do is I can use this point to figure out what b is, because this point has to work in my rule. Okay, this point says that if I plug in the number 5 for x, right here, that when I do the math that you see here, I should get an answer of 14. That's what that rule, that point states, that if you plug in 5 to your rule, you'll get an answer of 14. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to plug in 5 for x, so 3 will stay, 5 goes in for x. B is going to stay because I don't know what b is, and I'm going to plug in 14 for y, because I want to figure out what b has to be so that this point, 5, 14, will work in this rule that I've started. So let's see, I'm going to do the math by timesing 3 times 5, and then I'll subtract 15 from both sides. I'm solving for b. I'm figuring out what b has to be to make this rule work. -1 equals b. So apparently, if instead of b right there, if I put in right here -1, and now if I plug in 5 for x, I should get a number that equals 14. And it looks like 3 times 5 plus -1 does in fact give me 14, because I get 15 plus -1. So this rule works for both requirements. It has a slope of 3, and it goes through the point 5, 14, because when I plug in 5, I get an answer of 14. So this is the rule for my line. The rule is y equals 3x plus -1. Okay, so review what we did. We plugged in what we knew, and we figured out what we didn't using the rule that we started. So let's take a look at one more example, because it gets a little bit harder. So let's look at the next example. The next example says write a rule for a line that goes through the points 5, -2, and 4, 3. So now they give me 2 points. The rule stays the same. I still want to know y equals mx plus b. Okay, that's how the rule should look. I still have 2 values to find, m and b. This time they didn't give me either value, so I have to find both of them. So remember, slope is always going to be the one you find first, unless they give you b. So in this case, I'm going to find slope first, and I'm going to review that slope is rise over run. It's delta y over delta x So those two mean that I could graph it and figure out what the rise and the run are, count it on the graph. So you can always go back to graphing. So if you want to find the slope, graphing is an easy way to always do that. But I'm going to practice using the equation that we talked about at the beginning of the video. So the equation for slope is subtracting the y's over subtracting the x's. Okay, so it's the difference of the y's over the difference of the x's. So let's see, this is my two y values. So I'm going to do 3 minus negative 2, because this is my second y value, and this is my first. So since I went in that order, I have to keep it the same. On the bottom, I'm going to subtract the x's. 4 minus 5. 4 minus 5. Let's see what I get. On the top, it looks like 3 minus negative 2 is the same as 3 plus positive 2. So I'm going to write 5 on top. And then 4 minus 5 is a negative 1. So I'm going to simplify this further, because 5 divided by negative 1 is just negative 5. So this is my slope. I use my slope formula. So once again, I'm halfway to my rule. I know the rule has to be 5x plus some number b. So now I'm going to go back to what we did in the last example and plug in what I know. So we found the slope using the slope formula. Now I'm going to do the exact same step I did before to find b. I'm going to take the rule that I have, because I know the slope is negative 5 from my previous work. And I'm going to plug in a point again. I'm going to figure out, okay, I'm going to do my positive point, just because it's easier numbers, I think. So I'm going to plug in the fact that I know if this was 4, then y would have to be 3. So I have 3 equals negative 5 times 4 plus b, because I want a rule that works for the number 4 and gives me an answer of 3. So let's see, 3 equals negative 20 plus b. And I keep solving by adding 20 to both sides, and I get 23 equals b. So b must be 23 for this rule. And so I checked my rule. The good news is you can always check your answers. So my rule right now is y equals negative 5x plus 23. But I'm just going to check it to make sure, because it should work for not just the first point that I plugged in, the 4, 3 that I plugged in up here, but it should also work for 5, negative 2. So now when I plug in 5, I should get an answer of negative 2. So let's see what I get. Negative 5 times 5 plus 23. So I'm going to get negative 25 plus 23. And I'm going to get negative 2, just like I predicted. Just like I was hoping for, actually. So I was hoping for negative 2 because that is what this point tells me up here. And it looks like I got it. So this is the right rule. My rule for this problem is y equals negative 5x plus 23. So remember, you're plugging in what you know, and you always are going to find that slope first in order to find the information you don't know. So let's take a look at this one. It's very similar to example 2. They give me 2 points, and I have to find the rule. So it looks like I am going to start out by finding the slope, so I can give my rule one of the 2 values. So slope is the difference in y's over the difference in x's. So I'm going to subtract the y's minus the x's. So it looks like 8 minus 2 on top, because those are my y values, over 16 minus negative 8. On top I get 6. On the bottom I get, let's see, 16 minus negative 8. That's like 16 plus 8. And I get 24. So I'm going to simplify that. You can use your calculator to try and see what it simplifies to. Or you can understand that to simplify a fraction, you divide top and bottom by something they can be divided by. Same thing, top and bottom. So 6 divided by 6 works, because that gives me 1. And 24 can also be divided by 6. so I get 1/4. If you used your calculator, you would have gotten a nice decimal of 0.25. But it's best to try and leave things in fraction form, especially if we're trying to graph things. They're a little bit easier to graph when they are fractions versus decimals. So we're going to keep 1/4 as our value, and we already have one part of our rule. Our rule right now is 1/4 x plus b. So once again, I'm stuck because I do not know b, and I need to go one more step in order to find b. So I'm going to go back to my points up here, and I'm just going to pick one. Once again, I'm going to pick the one with positive values. I think I make less mistakes with positive numbers. So I'm going to plug in what I know. So from this rule, I know that if I plug in 16 for x, so 16 in for x, I should get an answer of 8. So I'm going to try and figure out what b makes that possible. So I'm going to do the multiplying of 1/4 times 16. Don't be afraid to use the decimal and do 0.25 times 16 in your calculator if that's hard for you, but you should get an answer of 4 equals 8, and then I have the plus b still. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides and get an answer of 4. So my value of 4 is my b value. So my rule is finished with y equals 1/4 x plus 4. And one last check will allow me to make sure that I know my answers right. So I'm going to use one more time, I'm going to use the extra point that I was given here and check that my rule is right by plugging in that point as well. So I'm going to take my rule that I have written and plug in -8 for x and make sure I get the right value for y. Y equals -8 times 1/4 is -2 plus 4. Looks like I'm going to get 2, which according to this point is what I should have gotten. Because when I plugged in -8, I should have gotten 2. And I got it. So my rule is correct. This is the correct rule for those 2 points. Okay, so keep those 2 things in mind, those really important pieces. Number 1, that you have to find, you have to know that the rule is y equals mx plus b. And that to find the slope, you're often going to have to do the formula, where you subtract the y's over the difference of the x's. Okay? And then the b value you'll often find by plugging in the points that you know. So those are the 2 formulas that you're going to need in order to help you solve some of those problems on the worksheet. But definitely ask more questions if some of this did not make sense. And when you're working on it, if you get stuck, definitely ask your teacher for more help.